The UN has reported an unusual spike in the number of Syrian refugees fleeing the country. 11,000 have entered Turkey, Jordan and Lebanon in the last 24 hours alone. Sky News has also uncovered evidence that Syria has been using illegal cluster bombs against its own people, despite denials from the government. Sky's special correspondent Alex Crawford travelled between Tal Rifat and Aleppo, and she sent us this report.
The hole has been gouged out and the surrounding walls pockmarked with shrapnel from the latest weapon to be unleashed on the Syrian people by their own president. The weapon is banned internationally, but here the civilians talk of cluster bombs raining down on their homes.
All those pitted holes are the cluster bombs.
We
never heard before when a president will throw cluster bombs at his people.
Bashar al-Assad's regime denies using these, but when we went to Tal Rifat in northern Aleppo, we were shown scores of cluster bombs, many unexploded and still deadly, but kept by the civilians as evidence of what they believe are war crimes.
When did this land?
10 days ago.
The danger of cluster bombs is that they scatter bomblets over a wide area, and many don't immediately explode. These are some of those collected by the people in Tal Rifat.
These holes are where the cluster bombs landed, and because they were showered over a field, which is mainly soft soil, that's one of the reasons why they didn't go off. But a number of them didn't go off when they landed on the roofs and ceilings of houses. So many of these people have got unexploded bombs in their homes now.
The Assad regime has been stepping up its airstrikes, dropping cluster bombs, but also, as this rare footage shows, homemade barrel bombs packed with explosives and equally indiscriminate. The centre of Aleppo city is strewn with rubble. This was once a mosque, flattened by one of those barrel bombs. Nothing is off limits, it seems, to the regime. Yet somehow the rebels are inching forward, street by street, often using weapons and bombs they've made themselves. The shock absorbers are from a motorbike. The handlebars are too. They're now being used to guide the rebels' makeshift anti-aircraft gun. They've all but given up waiting for help from outside, and the rebels are building their own arsenal. They each have their own homemade hand grenade. One of the commanders in Aleppo shows us what they're taking on Assad's tanks and troops with. There are Molotov cocktails loaded with petrol and strips of tyre which will burn for some time. There are hand grenades packed with explosives and metal shards to cause maximum damage. And they've made rockets which they can fire from machine guns. The metal tube is a rudimentary silencer so they can take on the regime snipers. The lack of response from the West to their continued appeals for arms will be remembered long after the fighting finally stops here.
After the revolution is over, how will the Syrian people feel towards Britain and America?
Of course we are going to boycott them. We sold our own houses to fund this revolution, and they didn't help us.
The commander and bomb maker tries out the fresh stock. The first Molotov cocktail fails to explode, but they have more luck with the second. They say they can make their own hand grenades now in less than 10 minutes. But they are no real match against the regime's weaponry. The rebels are certainly getting stronger with piecemeal help from sympathetic neighbours. But both sides in this conflict still think they can win this, and the second winter of war is only weeks away. Alex Crawford, Sky News in Aleppo.
Well, let's go live now to our central London studio where we can speak to Syria commentator Ammar Wakaf. And in our Westminster studio is Donatella Rivera, a Syria expert at Amnesty International. Donatella Rivera, if I can start with you, does what our correspondent Alex say and has found on the ground there with regard to cluster weapons corroborate with what Amnesty is being told?
Yes, and actually with what I have found on the ground in the past 6 months, I've spent most of the time in Syria. I saw cluster munitions having been used. I mean, I saw them with my own eyes, unexploded cluster munitions, which remain a deadly legacy for a long time to come. And in recent weeks, over the last sort of 7 weeks or so, the use of cluster bombs has increased dramatically. But certainly I saw the ones that had been first used at the beginning of July, of last July. So this has been going on for several months.
Ammar Wakaf, you have called for regime reform rather than regime change. But if the regime is found to be using weapons that are banned under international law, then surely that regime has to go.
Well, I mean, part of the reason why the regime is still in place is that the alternative is much worse. And I can only speak for the Syrians who really do not want this revolution because they know that it's going to be much worse than the current regime. The only option we've had from the start is to push the regime, push the government to adopt more liberal, reforms and so on and so forth. I think the question that the regime has to go, which still is actually on the minds of many politicians in the West, is what has led things to go this wrong, actually.
Donatella, would you like to come back on that?
Well, I mean, we're a human rights organization. Amnesty International is concerned with the plight of the civilian population. The civilian population is being mercilessly pounded, mostly by government forces, including through the use of widespread indiscriminate attacks and the use of banned weapons such as cluster bombs. Increasingly, we're also concerned about the behavior of the armed opposition groups who are also committing the human rights abuses. We have no evidence that they are targeting civilians in any way as government forces are doing, but they're certainly committing serious abuses, including war crimes, by, for example, torturing or executing the soldiers or the suspected militiamen that they capture. There are other concerns which have to do with the inherent problems that come with urban combats. In a city like Aleppo, where you've got government forces and armed opposition groups fighting it out, neither side terribly careful about the kind of disaster that they bring on the civilian population. So I think that, there needs to be less politicking and more done to ensure that the civilian population is protected, because quite frankly their situation is desperate and getting worse by the day.
And now you talk about the regime being persuaded to adopt more liberal policies, but surely that is impossible with President Assad at its head. David Cameron has suggested that he be given safe passage from the country. Is that the solution?
Well, I think, again, I have to repeat that the preoccupation with the fate of President Assad has really, heavily had an impact on the Syrian population and the Syrian state in a most negative way. Now, the issue is that I do appreciate all the recognition of the atrocities committed by the rebel groups. I've just seen your report. It's quite sympathetic to those rebel groups. Actually, those rebel groups have a lot of weaponry at hand, and yesterday and the day before, they, for example, targeted civilian areas that are mostly, or residential areas that are mostly inhabited by minority groups in Damascus, in Al-Mazzi and Hayy al-Tadamun and so on and so forth. And this was reported on the media as unified sort of rebels actually targeting government buildings or to government targets in Al-Mazzi. There is a lot of what is going on in Syria that is being unreported. And, there is a lot of atrocities that have been committed. I have, for example, a brother-in-law who was tortured to near death, not because being of any government affiliation of some sort, but because they didn't like him. They didn't like his probably skin color or something. A lot of beheading videos that we are seeing. And all of this is taking place, and people are not really shedding any light on it. And this is what keeps the Syrian people really not wanting to get rid of this current government, because they fear that, what is going to come next is actually more horrible. I have to only give one example, that the person who is regarded as the patron of the Syrian so-called revolution, Sheikh Yusuf Qaradawi, residing in Qatar, was refused entry to the United Kingdom for incitement of hatred. It's the same thing. They just, you hear the Allahu Akbar thing and the beheading of someone, and I really don't know how the British government can actually support such people or find itself in a position where it's allied with such people.
I suppose, Donatella, that whatever may be disagreed upon here, the real question is there any end in sight? We're getting on to the second winter of the war in Syria now, and the opposition meeting that was held in Doha seems to have ended in more confusion. Do you have any hope that there can be resolution?
Well, certainly there is nothing there is nothing that indicates that any sort of political resolution is in sight. What we're seeing armed opposition group who are getting their hands on larger quantities and more sophisticated weapons because they are managing to overrun government positions. So what they haven't been getting from outside, they are now getting in larger quantities from Syrian military bases, air defense bases. So if anything, that's an indication that the fight is going to become even more bitter than it has been until now. As for reports that the British Prime Minister might have suggested that a safe haven might be provided for President Assad if he were to decide to step down. I mean, we shouldn't forget that international law is above any bilateral or multilateral agreement. So nobody in this world is in a position to give any assurances, neither to anybody on the Syrian government side and by the same token on the rebel side. That is to say that anybody on either side, government or opposition, who has been committing war crimes, and both sides have been committing those, even though on a much grander scale on the government side.
And Donatella, I'm afraid we are out of time, and there we will have to leave it. Forgive me for interrupting. Donatella Rovera and Ammar Wakaf, we appreciate your time. Thank you.